Welcome. There's a new firmware update. Would you like to download that now? You can say yes or yes. Is that okay?
No, don't download.
Firmware update downloading for your convenience.
No. Ugh. How long until we can ride?
Pre-ride checks initiating. It seems that you have installed
third-party grip tape.
Is that correct?
Yes?
I'm sorry. I'm going to have to limit your trip distance to 5 miles for your safety. Would you like me to place an order for new footpads?
Dear God, no.
You would like to meet God? I can help you with that. Nosedive scheduled for
Riding arrow.
miles into ride. Is that okay?
No. Turn that off.
Turning off. Thank you for being part of the Onewheel family. Your stoke and safety is important to me. Shred you later.
Hello everyone. In this video we are going to take a frank look at the Onewheel GT. There are some negatives in this review and some of those things may offend some viewers. But the reality is that one review that's not entirely positive is unlikely to sway the opinion of prospective buyers that by the time they get to any video probably have already made up their mind on whether or not they're going to buy something. So the goal here really is to try to normalize a more honest discussion about a product because the product, the Onewheel GT, doesn't exist in a bubble. And just because it is currently the only higher performance one-wheel self-balancing board doesn't mean it's the best thing ever. Now, in the interest of respecting your time, if you don't have the time to watch or listen to this entire thing, I will include this too long didn't watch segment where I sum up the review in as succinct and terse a way as I possibly can. The only redeeming factor of the Onewheel GT is that it is markedly more powerful than the Onewheel XR. Because of that, it is much harder to nosedive, it handles inclines better, and generally does much better off-road. Aside from that, in my opinion, the rest of the board in terms of quality and serviceability is inferior to the prior flagship, the Onewheel XR. So there, if you'd like to know more, then just continue watching. There's no denying that the GT has a lot of punch. It hits way harder than the XR ever could, whether that's accelerating off the line, climbing up warranty-voiding inclines, crushing game-changing trails, or ghosting into people and property. But in all seriousness, the GT is a very powerful one-wheel. Combined with the elevated power band offered by the higher voltage system, yes, that's actually a thing, the pushback as a speed governor makes it nearly impossible for a general/casual rider to nosedive. The GT is also quite striking. In appearance, not just in, you know. When the Pint released, the phrase I heard most was that it finally looked like a product, as opposed to the Onewheel XR, which looked like a DIY project cobbled together in someone's garage. Which, looking back, is probably one of the sadder things that could have been said. It more closely mimics the trendy ethos of Silicon Valley tech, and not so much the rugged industrial squareness of the prior flagship. And my favorite one-wheel, that thing. Lastly, it rides like a one-wheel. It's relatively smooth in ride, it does inspire confidence in terms of its power, and when going over rough terrain, bumps, holes, cracks, whatever, it does leave me slightly less scared of an impending nosedive than old Atticus Finch over here. Oh, and the range. It's generally as advertised, which is good, and that is consistent with prior models of Onewheel. I do appreciate that they are generally conservative in their range estimates and promises, and in the case of the Onewheel GT, give you a very wide range of range estimates for you to experience. However, the recent firmware update broke my battery meter, so my Onewheel GT kicks me off at about 14% now. Great job, software engineers at Future Motion. You're doing God's work. This Onewheel post firmware update now bucks me off at about 13 or so percent. That's what it's at now. It went from having 2 battery indicator lights to flashing red and beeping. I rode it for about 8 minutes, and when I came home and checked the app, it is at 13%. Prior to the firmware update, I rode this thing all the way down to 1% before it was entirely unrideable. And now I can only get down to 13%. This seems worth mentioning because I am now the 5th instance of this being brought to my attention. I had heard it 4 times prior to me trying it myself. I did do a range test prior to the firmware update, got all the way down to 1%, hadn't done it since, and so here's my attempt to get down to the bottom of the charge, and I get to 13%, and it tells me I'm done. So that's wonderful. Now, with great power comes great heat generation, that's correct. And unfortunately, the heightened power of the Onewheel GT wasn't properly managed, and so it overheats, especially in warmer weather and off-road. Now, maybe your Onewheel GT doesn't overheat, and I'm very glad for that. Good. However, many of them do. Mine does, the GTs of many of my colleagues that I ride with do, and it is an ongoing issue, and there are reasons for that. Now, for context, the Onewheel has had a hypercore motor since the Plus was released. That is the model that was released before the XR. Now, the hypercore basically is a censored brushless DC hub motor. However, what differentiates it is that the axle itself is a very thick chunk of aluminum that serves as a heatsink, drawing heat out from the core of the motor. And since the stator is where the windings are, that is where the power cycles, and so that is where heat is generated. On the Plus and the XR, what you have here is the axle mounted and clamped into this block, which itself is bolted into the rail. Standard fare for a Onewheel. However, the rails have, up until now, with the Pint and the GT, been a machined anodized aluminum with a relatively flat surface, and so the axle into the mounting block into the rail has served as a heatsink and drawn heat from the axle out into the frame of the board. However, with the GT, you have something very different happening. So you still have a hypercore motor in that it is using the axle as a heatsink to draw heat away from the core of the motor into a mounting block. However, something that they moved to in the Pint and now on the GT is that the rails are no longer machined anodized aluminum. These are cast aluminum, so they're poured into a mold to make this shape. And since the surface finish of casting is usually pretty rough, it seems that rather than putting extensive cost into refinishing it and readying it to be anodized, they instead went with powder coating. And so that's something that was seen on the Pint. And so powder-coated cast aluminum is much cheaper than locally sourcing 3D machined billet aluminum that then has to be anodized. Because anodizing doesn't cover rough surface finishes. In fact, it tends to highlight them. So to make anodizing look good, the surface finish of the aluminum has to actually be proper. It has to look good, and then you anodize it to a certain color. And powder coating masks bad finishing, or in probably this case, I assume, unfinished cast aluminum, because it is a coating that goes over the rails. The problem with that is you have the axle pulling heat from the core of the motor into the mounting block, and that is where the heat stops because powder coating is inherently insulative. It does not allow for a good thermal medium between the mounting block and the rail. So in the XR, you actually have the rail serving, especially in this area, as an extension of the heatsink. In the GT and the Pint, that doesn't happen. This area gets a little bit warm, but the powder coating serves as a barrier. It's insulative to the heat that is coming off of the axle into the mounting block. That is generally why the GTs are overheating. Now, you don't see that kind of overheating in the Pint because the Pint is still a 15S system, so it's the same voltage as the XR. This running at 18S with an increased amount of power to the motor means that the motor is itself generating more heat, and in addition to that, you are having a stoppage of heat sinking coming off of the axle through the mounting block because the powder coating is acting as a thermal barrier to the rails. So this is cheaper and easier to produce. However, it does end up in lower performance because now you have all of that extra heat being generated from all the extra power of the GT getting stalled at the axle block. And that is generally why one would notice this overheats. There's also the tire. This tire is absolute dog shit. And it is actually kind of infuriating. Because not only did Future Motion change the rim size to prevent the use of commonly available aftermarket kart tire sizes, for no reason other than market control, the tire that they went with and will now sell to you is garbage, figuratively and literally. Now the XR used a Vega tire, which was not the favorite tire to be used on a Onewheel XR. However, one could not argue that they were inconsistent or poorly made. It's just the shape and behavior of it in ride was not what a lot of folks ended up enjoying as much as different tires. However, the tire on the GT is also made by Unily, and that is transparent from the type of markings that are on the sidewall, as well as the rubber compound markings denoted on that tire. Now, the issue with these tires is their abnormally high defect rate. When the Pint tires were released, there was an occurrence of defects. I had some of those myself, both in stock tires and in aftermarket purchase tires, where the carcass itself would be formed unevenly. There would be bumps along the perimeter of the tire. There would be malformations in the shoulders, and you would have generally defective tires at a higher rate than you would see from other companies. It is, after all, a budget tire. It is meant to be inexpensive and to be burned through quickly, and so the amount of quality control they have per unit is likely very low. And that seems to be the case on the GT. This tire also has a mild defect. The profile from shoulder to shoulder is not symmetrical. When you're looking from the tail to the front, the left side of the shoulder has a steeper slant to it than the other. So the turning behavior toe to heel is not even, and speeds above 17 miles per hour, there is a severe and pronounced wobble coming from this tire. Now, there are two issues I have with them using this tire. One is that this tire was purchased retail, and they offer an XR sized version of this tire. This tire was $22. The XR version, I believe, is somewhere around $25. That is the same type of tire being used with the same type of rubber and the same type of fairly low quality control being offered by Future Motion for however much they are now selling it for. Whether that's via a tire change that they perform, or if you just buy the tire, you're paying however much you're paying, and the markup on these is stunning. Now, that notwithstanding, because you may or may not begrudge them the ridiculous markup, the issue is that the high defect rates for these tires lead them to be junked. If you get a board and the tire is defective, they may replace it under warranty. However, the end result is that the tire that was defective gets thrown away. Maybe you don't care about that and your only concern is the end result to you. However, the amount of literal garbage they're making, to me, is not good. Because what essentially happens is they have a volume arrangement of tires with a higher defect rate, and it still generates them enough profit to be able to continue with a low level of quality control, replace the defective tires, junk those, and still be content with a low quality control rate of a tire. Which I don't personally agree with, because the tire is one of the most important aspects of a Onewheel. It is your single point of contact with the road, and it is what dictates a majority of the feel of the board. As is made apparent by this being the tire that they've chosen, that cost cutting and increasing the margins on the product is much more important than the overall quality of the product. Now moving on to the foot pads, the plastic injection molded foot pads are simply not very good. The Onewheel XR used wooden foot pads, and while these were far from perfect, the wood material offered a slight bit of warmth that, to some extent, dampened micro impacts and vibrations, and overall lent to a much more premium feel of the ride. These are hard, cheap, and harsh. They're essentially concave pint foot pads with coarse grip tape, which is, in my opinion, a drop in quality for the flagship model. The bumpers are generally okay, but one thing that has become apparent is that there is very little material right at the curve, and so if you're the type to have to drag your tail for emergency stops and things of that nature, these will wear out very, very quickly. Granted, they are a wear part, and replacing them is part of the maintenance of the board, but hooray for continued accessory sales instead of thinking about longevity. And then there's the ugly stuff. Now, to start off with something relatively banal, is the charger is proprietary on Onewheel GT. Not the brick is pretty much the same as it's always been, but the plug. The plug, aside from being a proprietary connector, also houses a PCB, seemingly for the purposes of communicating with the BMS, and therefore preventing use of third-party chargers. Then there's, of course, the larger issue of repairability maintenance. For example, changing the grip tape on the Onewheel GT is very much frowned upon. In fact, in the manual, which, as far as I'm concerned, is what matters, despite what their social media and promotional materials say. What's in black and white on paper is generally what actually matters, and that's more often than not what Future Motion goes by as far as how far they can push, not covering things under warranty. But changing your grip tape does void the warranty as far as your foot pads go, and using non-authorized accessories does void your warranty. Again, despite what has been said on social media, that's what's on paper and that's what matters. Also, if you unplug the battery in the Onewheel GT, it will render itself inoperable and you will have to send it back to Future Motion for them to reactivate it and fix it. If you have a worn out battery, or before even the battery wears out, it just becomes defective, which happens because battery cells are not perfectly made. You're out of luck and you're at the mercy of Future Motion. If you travel with your board, and as it used to be and is with the Pint and the Pint X so far, you can't take out the battery and just ship that. You would have to ship the entire device to your travel destination, which means that you now run the risk of losing the entire thing, which has happened, instead of just losing the battery and that being the only thing you have to pony up extra money for. Now, why is this part of the ugly stuff? Well, it unfortunately points toward the ethos and attitude of Future Motion as a company. And it seems to be that Future Motion is continuing to do very unfortunate and mildly indefensible things regarding serviceability, maintenance, and consumer interest, pretty much for the sake of control and profitability. Again, that is going by what is in paper on the manual and the results of many a warranty and or out of warranty repair stories that have come from the community itself. If you're interested in those kinds of things, I will have several links in the description below. You can choose to follow those links and go down that rabbit hole, or not if genuinely none of that stuff matters to you. But it is important to realize that these things happen and Future Motion does these things because the Onewheel is Future Motion and Future Motion is the Onewheel. And while many people would like to simply separate the two things, in reality, that's not the case. So if you're not a fan of things like legal thuggery and suing third-party accessory and modification manufacturers, then that's something you're going to have to square away with the idea of buying a Onewheel from Future Motion. And I'm sorry if that idea bothers some viewers, but buying a Onewheel GT or any products from Future Motion does financially support their lawsuits against third-party manufacturers. I'm not saying you or anyone else has to care about that, but that is the case, and it's important to be made aware of that with your purchasing decisions. Would I buy a Onewheel GT now, knowing what I know, seeing what I've seen, and experiencing what I've experienced with the Onewheel GT? Probably not. If it were not for this channel, I likely would not buy a Onewheel GT. That does not make the Onewheel GT a bad product. In and of itself, it works mostly, It functions fine. Dangers notwithstanding of the ghosting issues and things of that nature, it is a good board. However, just going forward with the way that Future Motion seems to want to continue behaving in the community, it's not something that I personally feel amazing supporting. So I hope any of this information was useful to you, and upcoming will be reviews of other PEVs as well as a very long build series where I take salvaged parts and some new aftermarket parts and cobble together an open source based, VESC-based, Onewheel XR-ish type thing. And so I'm going to take you from top to bottom of that. It will take a little while. There will be many videos in that series, and I hope it will be, if not entertaining, mildly useful to you as you continue on your one-wheeled self-balancing board journey. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate your viewership. Please take care of yourselves and try really hard not to fall.